And hello. Today we are going to be going over the process I use when I'm taking a raw 3D print and taking it through sanding and then getting it ready to be molded. So I'm going to go over how to make your prints look a lot better, make them look finished, and then they're either ready for paint or they can be ready for molding. So that's what we'll be going over today. So here we have pieces that are in different stages of being ready to be either painted or molded. And I'm going to kind of go over the different processes and the different ways I go about it. So right here we have, this is a raw print. Came right off the printer. I put a couple pieces together, but I'm keeping a couple separate so it'll be easier to cast. And the first thing you always want to do when you're looking at your print is look for problem areas. Now sometimes with the print, you can definitely see it on this guy here. You're going to get some rough edges. That's just kind of the nature of the business when it comes to printing. So I always start off by just looking at it and see if anything needs to get a good sand before I do anything else. So this one, it's a little rough. And I like to use my old handy Dremel here. I'm going to turn the speed down. Now you don't want to sand too much on a 3D print. You don't want to go through that top layer. And I'm going to be able to fill in a lot of these cracks later, so I'm just going to get a lot of the burrs off the top. Let's speed up a little bit. Just want to make sure that you don't cut through it and get into those filler areas that are underneath the print. You see, I just wanted to get those burrs off. It's still rough, but we'll be able to fix that a little bit later. And those are the kind of things I look for when I'm looking at my prints. So let's take a look at this guy here. And he's looking pretty smooth everywhere. Got a couple burrs on the inside of the trigger guard there, but we should be able to get those out, no problem. Bottom looks pretty good. So this one's actually looking pretty good. We can move on to the next stage. Now the first thing I always do is I like to use XTC 3D. It's really good for filling in the layer lines. You can get this on Amazon, or I got mine through Reynolds. It's really good. It's self-leveling. It helps to get a lot of those layer lines out pretty easily. Now you can also use Epoxy. This again you can get on Amazon. This is another type of finishing resin. It's also self-leveling. Difference between the two that I found, this one's a little bit easier to mix. It's a 1-to-1 ratio. So you just take equal parts of both and works pretty good. The only reason I don't like this one, it's a little bit runnier, I found. It leaves a little bit more of drips on things sometimes, whereas the XTC 3D tends to be a little bit better at the self-leveling and helps to keep everything level. It doesn't have as much sanding afterwards. So I'm going to go ahead and use the XTC 3D and put my gloves on here. Remember, you must always make sound effects while you work or you will go nuts. And then I'm basically going to mix it here, and then I'm going to use my foam brush here to apply it. Now, one thing you want to keep in mind when you're using the XTC 3D. Number one, you want to use thin layers. You don't want to glob it on real thick. And number two, when you're mixing it, you want to make sure you spread it out because this will kick pretty fast and start to thicken up. The thinner you keep it, the longer life you have to work with it. So I'm just going to take the part A here. And you don't want to do a whole bunch at once. It's better to do little bits and then remix. And this is a 2-to-1 mix ratio, so I want to use half of the part B to the part A. Now, you should be measuring this, but I've done it quite a bit, so I kind of know how to visualize it. There we go. That is official measuring right there. And then I just use a popsicle stick to mix it. And I can probably use a little bit more actually, because I'm going to be using it pretty quick. You want to make sure you mix this nice and thoroughly. You want to get that hardener with the resin. You see, I'm just kind of mixing it all together. Then I basically just want to start applying this in a nice thin, even coat over my piece here. Now be careful if you have really small intricate details, because this will fill in the details. So on some areas I'll kind of skip over a little bit because I don't want to fill in any grooves or anything I have like that. You just want to go through the whole piece and just give it a nice coat. And what this is going to do is it's just going to fill in a lot of those striations that come from 3D prints. Because remember, a 3D printer is basically just laying down a layer of plastic and a layer of plastic and a layer of plastic and doing that for a long time. So you're going to have those little bitty striations where those layers are. I'm just going through it. I'm giving it a nice even coat. Also, be careful of anywhere where you're going to have pieces joining together. In the top here, you can see that's where the scope's going to be mounted. So I don't want to put any in there because I'm going to change the size of it. And then you'll have to sand it back out to be able to make the pieces fit together well. So you also want to keep that in mind where you're doing it. This little bitty nub right here is going to have a piece go into it. Don't want to put any XTC in there. And again, I'm just giving it a nice thin layer. This is just the first part of getting it to look good. And I'm basically just going over the whole guy, giving it a nice even coat. Now the grooves here on the handle, I'm probably going to leave alone because they're looking pretty good. I'm just going to kind of go through and give it a nice even coat like that. And now I can just kind of set this guy off to the side and let him dry for a little bit. And I don't want to waste any of this, so I'm going to go ahead and do some of the other parts as well. So now I have the scope. Again, just doing nice even layers throughout the whole guy here. Now again, this is where it's going to attach to the main gun part. So I don't want to put any in here, thicken it up, it won't fit as well. give it a nice coat like that. Going through, giving it a nice even coat. Be careful about where anything's going to be joining. And now we can go on to this one. Basically, you let that dry for a while, and you basically end up with something like this. You can see it still has some of those striations, but it got a lot of them out. Now, it still has bubbles, still needs to be sanded. Remember, this is just the first stage of getting it to that final level. Yep, that one's looking pretty good. Now, there's another method you can use, especially for those big problem areas like we saw in this guy. Now, remember we had those rough edges down here at the bottom? Well, that XTC might not fill in completely, and I want to get it to be pure, nice, and smooth. So you can also use the next stage is dun 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 Bondo. Now I like glaze and spot putty. It's pre-mixed, it's easier to use. You just squeeze it out and apply it. And I basically went through and I just got one of those big applier things and cut it up into smaller pieces to give me a little bit more control. So I'm going to get that ready. I'm going to grab a towel here. And basically, I just want to squirt out a little bit. Again, this will start hardening, so you don't want to do a whole bunch at once because it has the hardener built into it. Then I'm basically going to apply just a nice little even coat on this to start filling in all those little lines and those burrs. Now I'm not going to be real exact. I'm not going to worry about, you know, if there's a little bit of high ridge, low ridge, because I'm going to go back and sand this eventually anyways. I just want to make sure I get enough in there that's going to cover and fill in all those big gaps. So I always want to make sure that there's enough where I'm not seeing any of those gaps and start to smooth it out a little bit. This is going to save you a lot of time instead of trying to fill all this in with just the XTC, because this is a little bit thicker. Now I'm not worrying about the inside because there's going to be a piece that sits in there. Again, you don't want to put anything that's going to build up the surface where you're going to have pieces meeting. You see, I just kind of get something kind of like that. Not perfect, but it's building up that area. It's giving me something to be able to sand off later. And I think on this guy, the bottom of that piece has a little bit too. Now, see how you get those little bitty striations? It's usually when you have a print that's going up on an angle, you get that layering effect. And sometimes that can be a pain to sand out. So to make your life easier, let's put a little Bondo in there. And that'll really take out those layers. Make your life a lot easier. Again, I just want to make sure I apply enough cover in those layers, and I'm not worrying about it looking exact yet. Just give myself a little bit of playroom to work with. Again, you can see on the back of this guy, it's got some of those little layers. And since I have some Bondo here anyways, I may as well fill this guy in a little bit. Now this one has a little bit of a height difference, so I want to make sure I don't completely get rid of that little layer it's got right there. But again, I'm just kind of helping myself out a little bit by giving myself something that I can sand down to make it look a lot better. Now in regular striations, usually the XTC is enough to get you a good start. There we go, that'll work. And as you can see, this is already starting to really thicken up. So this is pretty much getting to the point where I can't use anymore because it'll just start globbing instead of, you can see especially here. It's gonna start globbing up and not getting the result I want. So that's the other step, and this is basically the roughing out. Getting rid of the big problems and giving yourself time to work with so that when you start doing the fine detailing work, it'll be a lot easier for you. So now we will start looking at the next step. So after you're done with this, after it dries, the next step you want to do is once you have a nice dried piece of the XTC, you have a couple options. Number one, you can put another layer on if you still see a lot of striations, or you can start sanding it. Now, I typically start, and here's my cool little sanding kit. So I normally start with 320 on the rough. That'll give it a nice overall smoothness, and then I'll be able to move on from there. So if I just take this guy out, I basically just cut them into little squares. Now there's a really cool tool you can use. I got this on Amazon. It's a little 1-inch disc that you can put into your Dremel, and it has the Velcro. And you can get different grits that go on there. I have the 1-inch. Or the 1/2 inch and the 1-inch. 1-inch and 2-inch. There we go. Those are good to do, especially with things like blasters. We're going to have that nice smooth surface. You don't have to worry about that much. But every once in a while, I still like to use my hands. And I'm basically just going to kind of start working this guy with 320. And this is going to start getting rid of all those high areas. Now this is where the monotony comes in. Da, da, da. Sand, 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 and more sand. You want to start getting a little bit of a, it's still going to be rough, but you're just looking for a nice kind of even layer through it. So after this, you basically keep doing that until you get a nice kind of smoother area. And then the next step after this, what I do after I sand the XTC with the 320, is then I move on and use primer filler paint. Now this is going to take that little bit of a roughness you had with the 320 and fill in any of those gaps. Now this is the primer filler I like to use. The Duplicolor, it's nice and thick, and it really does work well to fill in a lot of those striations and those problem areas. And again, things like this I would sand down first before I apply the primer. But basically after you do the 320, then you apply your primer filler. You can see how this really starts to fill in a lot of those striations. Starts to give you a lot smoother finish. See, I can actually go ooh, smooth. So this is where the next step is getting it through the primer. Now once that primer dried, then you can go back to your sanding. Now this one has already had a little bit of work done, so I don't need to start with the 400. Normally I start with the 400 grit. I'm going to go right up to the 800. And one other thing you want to keep in mind when you are starting to do this. You want to kind of wet sand. It does help. It helps to spread out everything, make it a little easier and more level. So I'm just going to kind of give it a quick squirt. And then start working that. And you can see how I had a little bit already underneath there. Because I basically already did this whole process to this guy once, but I still had some striations showing through, just on a few areas. So I figured better to be safe than sorry, especially when I know I want to mold this. So I want to make it as perfect as possible. So I went ahead and added another layer of primer filler to help with those areas. And the cool thing about having the different color primer is you can actually see where those areas are coming through. And you can feel the difference as you're sanding. When you get into a nice smooth area, you can feel how it glides over it a lot easier. Just kind of going over the whole thing. Every once in a while I'll go through and kind of wipe off some of that. And basically, you start to get that really nice smooth finish to it. You can actually feel it. You start getting that really nice smooth finish to it. And you start to get to a point where it's looking good and it might almost be ready for paint. Now, this one, I may have to think about for a second. So basically what I was looking at when I was while I was sanding this model was this little bitty area right here. You can see how a little bit of the striations are showing through. Now if you feel it, it's perfectly smooth. Feels great. But those little bitty defects like that will actually show up in the mold. So I want to make sure I address that before I mold it. That way I won't have to fix it every time I cast it. Now this one, it actually does feel nice and smooth. It's got that smoothness I want. So once I hit it with the gloss black paint, it should be fine. One thing to keep in mind, especially if you're going to be casting the guns, is you want to make sure you paint it before you mold it. The reason for that is I want a nice glossy finish in my cast. To do that, I need a nice glossy finish on my model. It actually picks up that gloss from the model. So I'll be able to hit this with some nice gloss back paint, give it another quick wet sand, hit it with some nice clear coat, and then it'll be nice and glossy, getting ready to be molded. And then you end up with something kind of like this guy here. Now you can see I've hit this with the gloss black, and I've also gone over it with wet sand. You can see some of the areas there that picked up the wet sand. So this guy is just about there. All I have left to do on this guy is check for any little defects, hit it with some gloss, let that dry, and then I'll be able to mold this guy and get a nice good mold out of it. So that's kind of the process I use when I'm working with my 3D prints to do the whole process. I start with the raw 3D print, and then I can use either the XTC 3D or the Z-Epoxy to give it that first kind of layer that's going to fill in a lot of those striations for you, make your life a lot easier. And then you end up with something kind of like this, where you're starting to fill in those striations. And actually, as I feel this, I may end up putting an extra coat of XTC on this before I start doing any of the filler, but don't necessarily have to. That filler is really good stuff, and it will pick up a lot of those little areas that the XTC missed. Now again, if you have any big problem areas like this, that's when I would use the Bondo and kind of give myself a lot more to work with. And actually, this guy is starting to dry up, so I could probably start sanding it now just to see where I'm at. I'm going to let that set a little bit more. So that'll help you get rid of those bigger problem areas that are usually where there were supports from the 3D print, or where it was perfectly perpendicular, and the layers, you get that little bit of stepping action as it goes up and down an angle in the 3D print. And after that, you hit it with your primer filler. That'll get rid of a lot more of it and start to give you that real smoothness you're looking for and make it look like it's not a 3D printed object, it's just a cool prop. And then from there, you're going to go on to the paint and actually start to get that gloss finish you're looking for. And also the paint will help you pick up any defects a lot better. And then from there you do your clear coat. And after you do your clear coat, you are ready to mold it, or you are ready to use it. Add it to your costume, make yourself look all badass, and that's about it. Cool? Now, if you want to look into how to mold these after you get them done, you can also watch some of my mold making videos. Multitude is a way to do that, and I'm starting to make videos for each different types of molds you can do.